Hi, and welcome to The Lowest Crime, the podcast all about true crime cases from one of the lowest countries in the world, the Netherlands. I am Eline, and today we cover the tragic and controversial death of Paula H, who passed away after a fatal train collision. But was this a tragic accident, or was it something far more sinister? Before we begin, please be aware that this episode contains descriptions of a fatal accident and mental health struggles, which can be upsetting for some listeners, so listener discretion is advised. And as you all know by now, I try my very best to bring you all the known facts, but I am just an amateur podcast creator, so there is always a chance of me making a mistake. Without further ado, let's get into the railway murder. The railway line cuts straight across the quiet Zeedijk in Culemborg, a long straight road lined with trees, stretching through the flat Betuwe countryside. Despite the peaceful surroundings, the tracks themselves are busy. The crossing is well secured, half barriers that swing down, bright red flashing lights, and loud warning bells that almost hurt your ears when they start ringing. All sorts of trains race through there at full speed. From the Culemborg station, a few kilometers up the line, trains heading toward Den Bosch are already running at full acceleration by the time they reach this point. And coming from the opposite direction, train drivers don't need to slow down at all before passing the Zeedijk crossing. On Friday, August 1st, 2003, around 4:15 in the afternoon, the driver of the intercity to Den Bosch notices something unusual from far down the track. A white Ford Escort station wagon is approaching the crossing from the left. It slips around the barrier, which is already coming down, moving slowly, almost drifting onto the tracks. The Ford comes to a stop right on the crossing. The train driver watches as a man gets out of the car and runs back in the direction he came from. The man presses both hands tightly against his ears, bracing for the impact he already knows is coming. With only a few hundred meters left, the train driver immediately throws the emergency brake into action and sounds the horn. And right before he inevitably hits the car at almost full speed, he notices something far worse than just a car on the tracks. On the passenger seat of the car, the side his locomotive will hit in just a few seconds, he sees the faint silhouette of a woman pressing both hands desperately against the side window. Just before the train slams into the car, dragging the white Ford Escort for meters along the rails. The woman inside the car, Paula H, dies instantly, her body crushed beyond recognition. So much so that her son and daughter-in-law were only able to identify her by her rings, one of which was her wedding band. The minutes after the crash were chaotic and surreal. Witnesses rushed toward the tracks and saw Peter Van B, the driver of the car, and the man who had just barely escaped the same fate as his wife, on the ground, banging his head against the asphalt. He shouted, "Blackout! Blackout! My wife! My daughter! My son! Call my son!" When police and medics arrived, Peter only seemed to be more upset and had to be taken by ambulance to the UMC hospital. It didn't take long for authorities to come to the conclusion that Peter's story was not very convincing. Still that same evening, at 8:10, he was officially arrested, suspected of causing another person's death. One suspicion was that he had done so intentionally, the other implied it had happened through negligence. Either way, Peter for sure had something to do with it. He was questioned twice more that evening, and at 9:55 p.m. he was taken into custody. After a night at the hospital for observation, with no medical reason to keep him there, the police picked him up on Saturday morning and brought him to the station in Tiel. And the wheels of the investigation had begun to turn. But before we continue, let's go back in time a little bit, because who were Peter and Paula? And how did they end up here? Peter Van B, known as Piet in his youth, was born in 1942 in Amsterdam, but grew up in Culemborg, living close to the exact same railway crossing we know will play a crucial role later in his life. He did not complete his vocational school as a machinist and went to sea at the age of 15. Between ages of 15 and 21, he spent 2 years away from the sea, although it is not clear what exactly he did at that time. At 21, he moved to Utrecht, attending evening school, and briefly studied at an art academy. He later worked as a lab assistant at the academic hospital in Utrecht and considered a career as a lab analyst. Although he never completed formal training, he later worked in a laboratory at the chemical giant DuPont, and then around 1998 he retired. So he had already been retired for a few years before this incident took place. Paula, on the other hand, came from a large Catholic family of 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. She was the 9th child, born on June 1st, 1944 in Vleuten, and was her mother's favorite. Nothing she did was ever wrong in her mother's eyes. After her father passed away, when older sisters helped with the household chores, Paula once painted on the wall, "Housework, bleh." She was strikingly beautiful, slim-built with lovely hair, a stunner, as one of her brothers described her. Paula loved music, played guitar and violin, though her talents sometimes caused family friction. On one occasion, while the family was moving and cleaning, Paula played the violin, irritating her sister-in-law so much that the bow was snapped in two. Her family believed that she could have achieved more musically, but thought her character lacked perseverance. A friend from a small orchestra believed Paula had untapped potential, but it was never realized. Peter and Paula met at evening school in Utrecht, bonding over music and drawing. In December 1968, they married and bought a home in Culemborg. Their first child, a son, was born on March 1972, followed 3 years later by a daughter. But after the daughter's birth, Paula started to be unwell. She developed delusions, drank heavily, and paid less attention to her appearance and the household. She was hospitalized multiple times for a form of schizophrenia, and around that time also gained quite a lot of weight, which she attributed to her medication. The marriage lost its shine. Peter often spent time away, dabbling in antiques, visiting acquaintances for coffee and conversation, and occasionally seeing female friends. He enjoyed female company, but insisted everything remained proper, though those around him often took that claim with a grain of salt. Investigators spoke with many people in their direct and more distant surroundings. And though close family members had the legal right to refuse testimony about direct relatives, none of them exercised it. Among the more distant acquaintances that were interviewed, Peter was not viewed unfavorably. People knew Paula had problems, but Peter seemed caring and managed the household despite frequent absences. Okay, he could be forceful, imposing his opinions, and his frugality, sometimes described as stinginess, was notorious. For instance, Paula was not allowed to shop freely. Clothes were second-hand and they bought leftover bread at a low cost. But otherwise, he seemed like a fine guy. However, closer witnesses were more critical. They described Peter as selfish, egocentric, unpredictable, and hot-tempered. He tolerated no opposition, especially from his wife and children. He had extreme views that sometimes bordered on racism, and a former neighbor recalled that Paula had confided in her that she was afraid of Peter, even saying that he had once stabbed someone. It was said that earlier in his life, when Peter had sailed as a sailor during a trip to Finland, he went ashore in Helsinki before the ship's work was complete. The captain threatened to have him fired in Amsterdam. It's said that Peter grabbed a knife and confronted the captain in his cabin, stabbing him twice, with the captain dying as a result. Peter was later arrested, and 2 months later, a Finnish juvenile court sentenced him to 6 years, of which he served less than 3. Later in life, Peter had become estranged from his son for about 18 months, a relationship that only recently started to improve. His son described him as dominant, quick-tempered, and poor at expressing feelings. He stated that the marriage between Peter and Paula had broken down. They had slept in separate beds, and Peter viewed Paula as a burden. The daughter's view was even worse. She accused him of molesting her and her friends between the ages of 6 and 10, a claim Peter strongly denied. Peter lived in his own world and showed little affection to his children. Nothing they did was right, from household tasks to friendships. When asked if she thought her father was capable of murdering her mother, she said yes, without a doubt, believing that he had already committed a murder before. Paula's brother and sister, who had always kept close contact with her, and Peter's younger brother were also interviewed. They could not understand why Peter had not had Paula readmitted during a time that her health was very poor and unlikely to improve. They would also have understood a divorce. It was clear Paula and Peter were unhappy. Paula's brother recalled rushing over 3 times after Peter called, saying that he could no longer cope. It should be stated, though, that all witnesses were aware of newspaper reports and local gossips while Peter was in custody, suspected of murdering his wife. This may have affected testimony, especially from close family. On the day of the collision, Peter and Paula had gone shopping in Culemborg. Paula wanted to buy a swimsuit, as it was warm and she wanted to swim, a rare purchase given Peter's frugality. He rarely bought anything for himself or others, let alone expensive clothing. But on this day, he spent a lot on that swimsuit. Immediately after the crash, he shouted about his blackout. But not only that, he also exclaimed, "I just bought such an expensive swimsuit for her and now she won't be using it." Which, given the circumstances, could definitely be considered an odd thing to say. Peter cooperated fully with interrogations, though investigators noted contradictions, half-truths and unclear statements. He claimed that while driving onto the tracks, he experienced a blackout, hearing the bells but not the train. He heard his wife shouting and pushed her, shouting, "Get out, get out!" before running away in panic, even falling. According to those close to Paula, she normally did not wear her seatbelt because her extra weight made it uncomfortable, though she usually laid the seatbelt on her lap to avoid any fines. On the day of the accident, however, she was wearing her seatbelt, raising questions about whether this made it harder to exit the vehicle quickly. Peter insisted that they always wore seatbelts and found it unfair to be considered a suspect, claiming Paula had as much time to escape as he did. Beyond that, he remembered little or gave different versions of the story. Peter also stated that he had previously suffered from dizziness, which he could sense coming on. At the time of the accident, he was taking the prescription sleep medication temazepam. The leaflet explicitly warned, use of this drug may adversely affect your reaction time through the day, even after the effect of temazepam has worn off. Be careful when performing activities that require alertness, such as driving. He was therefore aware of the risks, but chose to drive anyway. On August 1st, 2003, while driving along Parallelweg Oost, he felt dizzy and initially pulled over, a correct response. But after feeling well again, he continued driving, ultimately ending up on the railway tracks, resulting in his wife's death. Investigators examined the car. The Traffic Investigation Unit found the Ford Escort had stopped completely on the second track, with the handbrake fully engaged. The vehicle had stopped on the left side of the tracks after Peter looped around the half barrier, matching the train driver's account. The ignition key was in position 1, but the engine off. The case was tried at the Arnhem District Court over multiple sessions between 2003 and 2005. Peter was charged with the intentional killing of his wife. The prosecution alleged that he drove onto the railway crossing on purpose, stopping the car and leaving it there, resulting in her death, and therefore sought a 15-year sentence. Knowing about Peter and Paula's estranged marriage, combined with accounts of Peter's history of violence and volatile temper, it's easy to see why people think he intentionally drove onto the tracks, setting up what could be seen as the perfect murder scenario. However, the defense argued that Peter did not intend to kill, citing his sudden blackout. Experts, including psychiatrists, neurologists, and psychologists, found no medical or psychiatric cause for the blackouts, but concluded that stress, sleep deprivation, and temazepam could have caused a temporary dizzy spell. The court noted that while the events appeared consistent with murder, driving onto the crossing with barriers down, stopping on the tracks, and leaving the vehicle, the defendant consistently stated that he did not know how it ended up there, and there was no evidence of his intent to kill. And because nothing could be definitively proven, as a result, the court acquitted him of murder. However, it did find that he acted negligently. Aware of his recurring dizziness and effects of temazepam, he continued driving. When he first felt dizzy, he pulled over correctly but resumed driving after feeling well, ultimately leading to his wife's death. For this lesser charge of gross negligence causing death, he was found guilty and sentenced to 102 days in prison, with time already served credited. In conclusion, the court determined Peter did not intend to kill his wife, but his decision to continue driving despite knowing the risks directly caused her death. The sentence only serving as a reflection of the seriousness of his negligence, but not of his intent to kill. The case of Peter van B. leaves so many questions about what really happened on that August 1st, 2003. The court determined that there was no evidence of intent to kill. Yet the circumstances, driving onto the railway crossing, stopping on the tracks and leaving the car, and taking into account their troubled relationship, have led to wonder whether or not this was deliberate. If it were, it might be described as the perfect murder, with no clear proof of intent and a meticulously orchestrated sequence of events leading to only 102 days in prison. Ultimately, we may never know the full truth. What is certain, however, is that multiple lives will never be the same. Not only was Paula's life ended way too early, but let's also not forget how awful it must have been for the train driver, who saw it coming but could do nothing to stop it from happening. This is truly one of those cases that leaves you to wonder, what on earth really happened, and knowing for sure that we will never fully find out. And that is it for today. Thank you all so much for listening. If you appreciated this episode, please leave a like or a comment, or consider subscribing to the podcast. It always helps me out tremendously. Thanks again so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.